listeners and learners? Welcome back to our next installment in the Foundational Molecules unit of biology. Today we're going to be focused on water and life, and it has a lot of really specific properties that make it really well suited for life. Like, there's a reason it's water and not something else. So water is H2O. Here's a little Lewis dot diagram of it. The two key things, the properties that are really specific, or I guess underlie a lot of the other more complicated properties that it has, are the fact that it's a polar molecule and that it can form hydrogen bonds. When you have water just hanging out, you are going to have a negative dipole on your oxygens and a positive dipole on your hydrogens. We talked about this a little bit in the chemistry and biology video. But as a result of this, you're going to see hydrogen bonds between the hydrogens and the oxygens of your water. And so if I decided to draw out a whole bunch more of these, you'd eventually see this great big web of all of your water globbed together, and between your oxygens and your hydrogens, you're going to be having these hydrogen bonds. In the case of water, as it freezes, these bonds crystallize and ever so slightly lengthen. And that's why your ice is going to be less dense than liquid water and it floats. Most things, as you probably know, in their solid form are more dense and are going to sink. So just kind of illustrating the way those hydrogen bonds have an effect that's more visual. The things we're going to talk about and focus on are more conceptual. Back to some vocab. So, first off, specific heat. Your specific heat of a substance is the amount of heat required to raise the temperature of 1 gram of that substance by 1 degree Celsius. Obviously, you could use other units, but it's to raise some mass of your substance by some temperature. I'd like to take a brief aside to discuss the difference between heat and temperature. Heat is a quantity of energy, and your temperature is giving you information about the average speed of molecules. So you could have two things that have the same temperature, say a mug of hot water and a bathtub. Maybe they both have water in them that's 100 degrees for some reason. Exact same temperature in the bathtub and in the mug. But you have a lot more water in the bathtub. So to get all of those water molecules up to the speed where they have a temperature of 100 degrees, you have to have a lot more thermal energy. You have to have a lot more heat. So that's the difference between temperature and heat. Water has a relatively high specific heat for its size. That is because of these hydrogen bonds. It's polar, can form hydrogen bonds, which altogether means that there's a lot of little connections keeping your molecules of water together. And so it takes a lot of energy to bring up that temperature. So, as a result of water having this high specific heat, it is going to change temperature slowly. One way to sort of think of it is it just holds onto heat really well. So, for example, if you have some piece of metal, you can heat a piece of metal very quickly, but it also loses heat very quickly. Water, on the other hand, retains heat very well, and it takes a while to change in temperature. So there's a lot of ultimate effects of this. You see this with large bodies of water. They help maintain a slightly more temperate climate on the land masses that they're next to. Also, it makes a lot of sense then why you're going to have water in a biologic system. It's a lot harder to affect, and so it's a little bit easier to maintain homeostasis with something that's, I'm going to use the word cooperative. It wants to stay around the same temperature. So those are some of the down the line effects of that. Our next vocab word is going to be heat of vaporization. So again, we're talking about a heat, so it's a quantity of energy. The heat of vaporization is the amount of heat that's required to change this substance from a liquid state to a gas state. So for something to evaporate, it needs to get up to temperature, you have to input your heat of vaporization, and then it's able to be a gas. In the case of water, or for the same reason, as it has that high specific heat, because it is polar and can form these hydrogen bonds, it also has a relatively high heat of vaporization, which means that for water to evaporate, you have to input quite a bit of heat. And that heat has to come from somewhere. The heat from the environment is what is going to allow your water to evaporate, meaning that heat is no longer in the environment. This is the reason that sweating works. When you're sweating, you are putting a layer of water onto your skin, and now you have this substance that when it gets up to a temperature where it can evaporate, if you're able to input that heat of vaporization, it can now move to a gas phase. And in doing so, it's taking that heat away from the surface of your skin, and now it's in the water, which is now in a gas phase and can move away from your skin, which is why it has that cooling effect. Next vocab is cohesion. So we're describing cohesion as the capacity of a substance to resist tension, essentially how much something sticks together. So you could contrast this with adhesion, so how much your substance wants to stick to other things, but cohesion is essentially sticking to itself. One way that we see cohesion in water is its surface tension. So water skippers, right, pond gliders can be on the surface of water without sinking into it because of how much the water wants to stick to itself and not break apart. You also see it, I think quite significantly, in the movement of water in trees. For a tree to grow, you need to get water from the ground all the way up to the top of that tree. And the way that that happens is as water transpires from the surface of your leaves, as it evaporates out of your leaf, it is going to then pull on the water that is next to it and still liquid in the leaf and just scooch it up that little bit as your water is evaporating. And ultimately, that water that your evaporating water pulls on is cohered to its neighboring water molecules, and so it'll pull on those, and you wind up pulling up this tube of water, and you're able to get water into all of the tree. And that's because of the cohesive properties of that water. One more thing about water is you will often hear it referred to as the universal solvent, basically because there are just a lot of things that dissolve in water. Quick review, just because it doesn't hurt to go over it again. A solution is formed when a solvent dissolves a solute. So the solvent does the dissolving of the solute. There are plenty of mnemonics and tricks to trying to remember this. I personally find that just hearing solvent dissolves a solute several times helps it stick in your brain. But back to water specifically, because it's polar and very abundant, you can dissolve a lot of things in it, which is where it gets that nickname. And as a result of being the universal solvent, there are a lot of very important biochemical reactions that take place in aqueous solutions and solutions of water. So we're going to move forward on our next unit and talk a little bit about macromolecules, specifically about proteins. To conclude, water is really important to life. It has some really specific chemical properties that come as a result of its own chemistry. Because it can form these hydrogen bonds and is polar, it has a high specific heat, it has a high heat of vaporization, and it coheres to itself really well. And all of those things play a really big role in the way you see water in biology. Thank you all for listening. Keep on learning.